related to state fragility and the resilience of criminal networks. This is part of a multi-country series of publications, one on Libya. There are others on Tunisia, Morocco, Chad, Niger, and Mali, specifically to each of those countries. But today we're going to be focusing only on Libya and Chad and Niger, and obviously tangentially the other countries as they're involved. This research was funded by the European Union, and today's discussion focuses specifically on human trafficking and human smuggling networks and their effects and the dynamics behind it for the year 2021 and partially for 2022. This is also part of Global Initiative's ongoing monitoring of migration throughout the North Africa region and the Sahel region. And I would like to highlight Global Initiative's methodological approach when it goes about doing its research, and that's what makes these publications so enjoyable to read, is the level of detail and analytical rigor that they impart. All of their work is triangulated based off of weekly online reporting, combined with Global Initiative's extensive network that triangulates any and all information with local sources and local researchers. I do want to remind everyone that this presentation today is recorded, so please make note of that when you leave comments or questions in the discussion box. And afterward, it will be available online as well. So now introducing you to our speakers. Mark McAuliffe is the director of the North Africa and Sahel Observatory at the Global Initiative, and he's going to be covering Libya. And then after Mark speaks, we'll move on to Alice Faraday, who is a senior analyst at Global Initiative, and she will be covering Niger and Chad. Mark?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amanda. Okay, so I'm going to try and keep it short as much as possible to allow for as much time for the Q&A as possible. But I'll try and go over the events as we describe them in the report, which primarily focus on 2021, but also setting them a little bit in the context of what's happened this year and how the research in the reports we're referencing played out in this year. So with that in mind, I believe that the timing of this reflection is especially important in respect to Libya, because the relatively quiet period following the last migration crisis between 2013 and 2017 has clearly ended. We have entered a new era of human smuggling and trafficking in respect to the industry in Libya. In the research that we present to you today, we were a bit cautious and tentative in our language, saying that we have possibly entered a new era. Since we finished that work, developments in the months that followed confirmed our thinking, and I think we can now be more unequivocal. Claudio, if you could, perhaps, I prepared a few slides. I'm not going to bore you with a million slides, but just for quick reference, can you please skip a couple of slides? Another one, thank you. So here, basically, this is data for departures between 2016, no, sorry, the previous one, Claudio. Yes, this is data for departures between 2016 and 2022. Note, I'm citing departures and not arrivals. And the reason for that is that in departures, we include the number of people who would have arrived in Europe, the number of people who would have been intercepted and brought back to Libya, and the number of people who would have disappeared, in most cases presumed dead. So as you can see, there was a major climb down after 2017. I'll be talking briefly about this. Then 2019 more or less stayed at the same level. or slightly lower actually. 2020 climbed a little bit, and then we see a leap in 2021, and up to October 2022, we're already more or less at the same level as last year already. So 2021, we can do away with this slide for the time being. 2021 saw a leap in departures, with more than 6,000 people leaving Libya for Europe. This compares to about 39,000 the year before that, and 19,000 in the year before that. As I said, up to October, there are already 62,000 departures from Libya. In fact, the summer of 2022, defined as the months from May to September, has been the busiest in terms of departures from the Libyan coast since 2017, with more than 48,000 departures within this time frame. That's 18,000 more departures than what was recorded in the same period in 2021. So in short, the headline explanation is, the first is that following the end of the war for Tripoli in the second half of 2020, mobility became far easier than at any point since the start of the war, which began in April 2019. So this goes to basic logistics, basically, which during a war context is often hampered, and was hampered, especially in the West Coast, which is the most prolific area in terms of human smuggling. The second was that the new government, the government of national unity of Abdelhamid Dbeiba, basically abandoned confrontational politics that his rival in the contest for the establishment of the GNU, Fathi Bashaga, who's now prime minister of a recently established and separate government, the Government of National Stability, had previously adopted as interior minister, favoring accommodation and patronage of militias across the West. As a brief caveat, as it turns out, after the contest for the GNU premiership, in which Fathi Bashaga presented himself as the law enforcement candidate, so to speak, Bashaga himself dropped that approach and went for a more accommodating co-option strategy, the likes of which we've seen successive governments employ in Libya since the revolution, and arguably also predicated on the political model pre-revolution. Obviously, the reality is more complicated than just these points can account for. I will go into a bit more detail, but the clearest summary of how the dynamics of human smuggling in Libya has evolved since the end of 2020 is that there's an environment of easier mobility in Western Libya that is coupled by an accommodating government approach. And these conditions have essentially led to the revival of integrated human smuggling networks that are able to transport, accommodate, and embark large number of migrants in a logistically more sophisticated manner. I'm not going to go into a very detailed history, but I think at this point it's worth saying a few words about the context in order to explain exactly how things have changed. So the explosion of human smuggling we saw in Libya between 2013 and 2017, which saw record number of irregular migrants reach Europe, and especially the Italian shores, basically resulted from the failure of post-revolutionary transition and the outbreak of the civil war in Libya in 2014, which in turn led to the fragmentation of the country into territorial fiefdoms dominated by different armed groups. Militias in turn turned to a predation model, drawing resources from the formal economy as well as the criminal economy, and human smuggling fell squarely within this frame. What's important to remember about this is that this basically enabled a very effective protection system which in itself then saw the business of human smuggling and trafficking expand in logistics, expand in capacity, expand in the number of migrants being processed, both by human smugglers as well as by traffickers, extorting them, detaining them, etc., etc. By the autumn of 2017, the system had begun to collapse, partly because of law enforcement policies enacted in transit countries, particularly Niger. Alice will be talking about this in a bit, but also largely in part of changes taking place in Libya. The then government of national unity moved to co-opt strategic militias that were known to be directly involved in human smuggling by offering them integration into the state apparatus. In exchange, they went from smugglers to police, in some cases a matter of weeks. This didn't work because of the financial incentive. The financial incentive was part of it, but it worked because these militias, unlike a classic mafia group, were and are political entities. They're known quantities. Their militia leaders are known quantities that have an eye on the political context, more so today, actually, than a few years ago. I'll touch upon this in a bit. Nonetheless, this wasn't a simple story of reform. Instead, a new class emerged among some of these armed groups, and their strategy for survival was basically to take a mantle of law enforcement while designating rivals as criminals, and in some cases, using this to expand their criminal business, sometimes even in human smuggling itself. However, the overt involvement in pushing migrants into boats had taken a knock. Human smuggling smuggling networks that had been operating at scale out in the open basically devolved into more clandestine and opportunistic outfits, also shrunk in size, working in the shadow with far lower capabilities. The net result was still a collapse of departures from Libya in 2018 and 2019, as you saw over there. At the same time, there was an military expansion of the Libyan Arab armed forces during these years, which eventually climaxed into the war of 2019. Which brings us back to the post-war period. So during the war, mobility was restricted, so we couldn't really see any of the changes that were taking place. After the war, that changed. The establishment of the GNU under Beiba basically saw a new wave of accommodation coupled with this new mobility, and that led to a significant revival of human smuggling. So now I'll come closer to where we're at right now. So the stability and conflict-free environment facilitated mobility. There was also, however, a return of sophisticated smuggling networks. So networks that weren't simply reacting to passing trade, but actually were creating demand. And the key feature of what we've seen in the past couple of years can be seen reflected in the fact and the growth of the smuggling of Egyptian and Bangladeshi migrants in particular. There was also an unprecedented scaling up of militia operations becoming involved in the migration management. So more militias becoming involved in detention centers and using detention centers as a dual focal point where the migrants are extorted, and at the same time, this law enforcement agenda is being projected. Also, militias becoming involved in maritime interception in a very big way, with now some militia players becoming critical players in the interception of migrants, as well as the interception of migrants and the arrest of migrants on land. So militias presenting themselves as a one-stop shop for migration management. I'll start closing with some more detail on what I mean by the return of sophisticated smuggling. So what we saw over the past couple of years is for instance, an increase of wooden boats, which are far more expensive than rubber boats and more difficult to procure, a growing average of number of passengers on board, and as I mentioned, the increasing prevalence of migrants from relatively wealthier North African and non-African countries. Together, Egyptians and Bangladeshis now constitute about 48% of all departures from Libya. A large cohort of them, especially Bangladeshis, obviously, land into Libya after traveling via air. Many of these migrants enter Libya in a regular fashion, very often through visa schemes that are not necessarily fraudulent, but sort of interplay with also fraudulent schemes. It's also important to say that many Egyptian migrants and many Bangladeshi migrants travel to Libya to work in Libya with no intention to travel irregularly, but increasingly that share is becoming smaller and smaller. With regards to Bangladeshis, in 2021, we saw this cohort emerge as the third largest group using Libya to reach Europe. Based on interviews we conducted with migrants, travel agents, visa agents, and other contacts, this is due to an expansion of pre-existing routes rather than any qualitative shift. According to our research, the vast majority of Bangladeshis take boats to Europe, fly into Benina Airport, where there's a visa regime which allows them to land and then secured by migrant labor agencies in Bangladesh in coordination with agents in Libya. Overseas embassies, such as in Bangladesh itself, but also in Dubai, also seem to be involved. So here we're talking about a much more sophisticated transnational type of mechanism than simply a small gang of smugglers in a coastal town reacting to migrants basically knocking on their door. The second component, which I spoke about, relates to this significant increase in militias becoming involved in migration management. The most significant example is that of the security and stabilization apparatus, which had a meteoric rise since 2021 when it was established, and now basically corners a significant component of interception at sea, as well as the detention system. In recent months, in the last couple of months, we saw this situation change partially due to the territorial map of and control of militias over Libya and the West Coast change as a result of the recent clashes that took place in Tripoli, which form part of this ongoing tussle between the government of national stability and the government of national unity. The militias that lost in the latest round of this tussle while trying to establish Prime Minister Fathi Bashagha in the capital and failing, many of them also lost territory. So in respect to the SSA, we are now seeing a conglomerate that's made up of their rivals. Primarily, I'm talking about Mohammed Bahroun and Mahmoud bin Rajab, consolidating further and further power over coastal areas between Janzur and Sabrata, and as a result, placing themselves in position to challenge the supremacy of the SSA as a sort of external entity that has become a critical player. All of this doesn't bode very well, because many of these militias and militia leaders have become much more kingmakers in the Libyan political establishment than they had before. So in a context where we're expecting, and I'll conclude on this note, greater fragility on the region as a result of external shocks, COVID having been one of them, but also the shock on the international economy from the Ukrainian crisis. Within the context of Libya, this is then amplified by the political penetration and state capture, the level of state capture that militias have managed to achieve. I'll stop here. I hope that should serve as a foundation for further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. As you were talking, one thing that came to mind that was highlighted in the paper, but you didn't really get into a whole lot. I was wondering if you might be able to expand on it. You noted the ease of criminal cooperation in Libya among different factions after the 2019 and 2020 conflict, for example, with the Magarha and the Bukmera and the Zintani groups. Would you be willing to expand on that just a little bit more, explain the difference between how those relationships changed from the 2019-2020 period and now?
So I think it happened at two levels. So one of them is a purely mechanic level, which is prior to during the war, that impinged very seriously on mobility and also on the relay that takes place between smugglers at various points of the routes. So, for instance, you had very serious hot points to the east and to the south of Tripoli, in areas that are typically very important relay points. For instance, there was major fighting around Bir al-Ghanam and to the southeast of Tripoli, and that fighting directly affected a lot of illicit traffic that typically flows through those areas, which obviously is not to be underestimated. The second component is that wars, this is not the first time that happens, forges new alliances and new opportunities. So, for instance, one example, again, in the west of Libya, stems from further connections between some groups in Zawiya and some groups in Gharyan, which weren't really there prior to the war, but during the war, so these groups work together on the front line against the common enemy, which at that point was forces of Haftar, and then basically translating that into a deeper relationship when it comes to illicit flows. And it's worth noting, I'm not just talking about human smuggling and trafficking, I'm talking about everything. I'm talking about drugs, human smuggling, subsidized goods, etc., etc. I think your microphone is off, Amanda.
Sorry. So we have a couple of questions here, but I think they'll probably be better for the end when we talk with, after we've heard from Alice and open it up for a broader Q&A. So Alice, would you like to go ahead and talk about Chad and Niger?
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. So in terms of human smuggling in Niger, what we've seen in recent years is that the most shifts have been related to adaptations to restrictions. And this has also been true for 2021, so the reporting period for our recent publication. So during that year, we saw human smuggling in Niger continue to adapt to the restrictions on movements that were implemented in 2020. So these were mainly the restrictions related to COVID-19 pandemic. So travel restrictions that really decreased the demand for smuggling services and increased security checks and restrictions. And this really made the transport of migrants through Niger more risky and more costly for both smugglers and for migrants. In June 2021, Niger reopened its borders and began a gradual lifting of restrictions. And although there's been a slight increase in the transit of foreign migrants through Niger, the numbers remain really low, and smugglers have maintained a lot of the adaptation measures and bypass routes that they had developed, because the transport of foreign migrants has always been illegal since 2016 and Niger's anti-smuggling law. So regardless of the border reopening, these movements remain clandestine. So while some smugglers have continued their activities, many actually shifted to alternatives such as fuel and goods smuggling, gold mining. Some smugglers also turned to more, let's say, illicit activities such as arms and drugs trafficking, or even armed banditry. And the other main shift is that obviously the transport of Nigerian migrants through Niger actually resumed legally in 2021. So these movements of circular migration of Nigerian migrants from Niger to Libya had been clandestine during the COVID-19 border closure. And with the reopening, we saw high numbers of Nigerian workers heading to Libya following seasonal and circular migration patterns. And although the transport of Nigerian migrants is much less lucrative for smugglers, it still provided a very welcome alternative for many of them, because their income from foreign migrants has just continued to dwindle over the last few years. For those few smugglers who have continued to transport foreign migrants through Niger, they've mainly resorted to different routes. So this is to dodge security measures by bypassing policed areas and major hubs. And they've ventured more and more into remote and dangerous territories. So these include the areas on either side of the main road between Agadez and Dirkou, and then further on to Madama, and also stretches of desert to the east of Agadez. These routes are obviously more dangerous, more remote, and they've led to dozens of deaths of migrants as a result of vehicle breakdowns and accidents in the desert. I don't know, Claudia, whether we can put up the map that goes with the presentation, just so that I can highlight some of these routes. Yeah, so next slide. Yeah, so here we have a map of the main human smuggling routes through Niger. And on the next slide, you can see one of the main bypass routes that has developed, so between the Nigerian border and the Libyan border. So this route is actually now one of the main itineraries used for the transport of foreign migrants. And although it's very difficult to say in terms of numbers, but a vast majority of foreign migrants now use this route rather than transiting through Agadez. The problem though with these routes is that, as I mentioned, they are more dangerous. So the use of these routes has really increased the vulnerability of migrants to insecurity, and in particular to armed banditry. So in the north and the northeastern areas of Niger. Armed banditry is not new, of course. It's been around for decades, but it's really been on the rise since 2020. And it's closely linked to the increased presence of Chadian armed groups in the area. So groups whose position as mercenaries in Libya was undermined by the 2020 ceasefire, and who subsequently moved south, so into these cross-border areas between Niger, Chad, and Libya. And what we've seen over the last year or so is that whereas they would previously target sort of high-value convoys such as drugs and gold, they've actually started to target human smuggling routes too. And we've seen several instances of migrants being kidnapped for ransom by these groups. And banditry is not only on the rise in these remote areas of the far northeast, it's also increasingly affecting main roads leading from Agadez to Dirkou. And it's taking place much more closer to cities and towns now. Well, the bandit groups involved in these areas appear to be local rather than foreign actors. So we also have a potential multiplication of actors. So in 2022, actually, moving on beyond the period of the report, We've also seen this trend continue and even expand. We've seen bandit attacks increasingly affect areas further west of the Agadez region towards Ahlit and the Chibahagaten goldfield. And in fact, a clear trend that's emerged in recent months is the targeting of gold convoys. So it's a really highly lucrative activity for bandit groups. And attacks on gold convoys have multiplied throughout 2022. And they've also triggered responses by local actors in the absence or the perceived absence of effective protection from Nigerian security forces. So what we've also seen in 2021, is the consolidation of a trend in which the flow of irregular non-Nigerian migrants moving to Algeria actually overtook movement to Libya, which is historically the most popular route to reach North Africa and Europe. So more and more migrants are now preferring routes through Algeria. So in Niger, new hubs, new human smuggling hubs have emerged to cater for this demand. So one of these, or the most important hub is Tawa, where quite sophisticated smuggling networks have developed. And at the same time, these routes have become increasingly risky for migrants, mainly due to the expulsion of migrants to Niger by Algerian authorities. So these have really picked up in the last year after a temporary decrease due to COVID-19 pandemic. What we're seeing at the moment are, in terms of the number of migrants who are expelled from Algeria, we're seeing numbers that are more or less the same as the pre-COVID period. So overall, over 2021 and into 2022, this period has been characterized by increasing human smuggling between Niger and Algeria, with new hubs to cater for the demand. Only a slight increase of foreign migrants transiting Niger since the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions, whereas Nigerian migration has fully rebounded. And lastly, the use of more remote and dangerous routes for the transport of migrants that has resulted in increased risks. So moving on to Chad. Claudio, if you could show the Chad map, that would be great. Thank you. So in Chad, most northbound movements involve prospective gold miners heading to the gold fields. And to a lesser extent, there are also Chadians heading to northern Chad or to southern Libya for business or personal reasons. Some foreign migrants also make the journey, usually with the intention of working in the gold fields before continuing the journey to Libya, so to make a bit of money to fund the rest of the journey. But the number of foreign migrants transiting Chad is very, very low. So most human smuggling dynamics in Chad are actually very closely linked to the situation in the north, and particularly in the gold fields. And in recent years, Chadian authorities have banned travel to northern Chad for most Chadians, due mainly to fears that they could feed into armed rebellion dynamics in the north. So over the course of 21, obviously human smuggling activity was heavily affected by political and security developments. Of course, in 2021, in April, the incursion by the FACT rebel group led to the death of President Deby. After Deby's death, there was very important military operations targeting suspected FACT sympathizers, especially in the Kanan region. And this really brought departures to northern Chad to a halt. These operations also affected migratory flows through the capital and via intermediary hubs across Chad. So really movements were severely impeded throughout 2021 and also into 2022. And I'll get back to 2022 a little bit later if I have time. So during this period, a lot of Chadians actually saw alternative routes to reach northern Chad and Libya. Some reportedly turned to traveling west to Niger and then up through Niger and then back into northern Chad or into southern Libya. And this is also due to the fact that the routes through Niger are usually far less risky for migrants, but also for smugglers, because migrants found traveling illegally in Niger are usually transferred to the IOM, or they can be released on the payment of bribes. Whereas in Chad, both smugglers and passengers face arrest and imprisonment. And so moving closer to the current situation, in 2022, flows to northern Chad were further disrupted by the closure of the Khouri-Bougoudi goldfield, so Chad's major goldfield that straddles northern Chad and southern Libya. So the goldfield was closed in May of this year due to the outbreak of inter-community violence. This led to the displacement of gold miners across Chad, particularly after the Chadian military evacuated all the gold miners from the sites in early June. And so all departures to northern Chad were completely suspended as a result of this conflict. And the disruption also affected the smuggling of goods and equipment from Libya, and other illicit flows, obviously, between Libya and Chad. And well, that's changed now because last month, Chad's authorities announced the official reopening of Khouri-Bougoudi goldfield. What we know so far is that there are different estimates in terms of the current population with the return of thousands of gold miners to the goldfield. These estimates range from like 5,000 to about 15,000. So this is still significantly less than the approximately 40,000 gold miners that were previously in the goldfield. But it's had a very significant impact in terms of the resumption of economic activities surrounding the goldfield, which are very important for local livelihoods. And obviously the reopening of the goldfield was met with enthusiasm by many smugglers across Chad. Activities did resume to some extent on routes from eastern Chad, so in particular between Abéché and Khouri-Bougoudi. These are routes that are typically less scrutinized than routes from the southwest. So on these routes, we saw human smuggling activity resume, and they're set to continue to increase. Flows from the southwest, and in particular from and through the Khanem region, remain very much suppressed for now, because movement from these regions to the north is still considered illegal and it's closely surveilled. So yeah, the reopening of the Khouri-Bougoudi goldfield is a really significant development, not just for human smuggling across Chad, but also for local economic, political, and security dynamics. So we'll obviously be monitoring the situation quite closely in the coming weeks, and it should also be analysed in the context of the latest political developments in Chad. I think I'll close there and hopefully allow time for some questions. Thank you.
Me first. I was wondering, Alice, if you could elaborate on a few other things that you had. Well, I think one is an original question, and then it ties into some of the other things that you mentioned in your reporting. I'm curious about the collapse of Agadez as being a hub, and then the proliferation of all of these other sort of neighboring hubs resulting from the crackdown by Nigerian authorities. What I'm wondering, one, is has the crackdown by Nigerian authorities followed that movement into these other new hubs, or is there no evidence of that yet? And then a follow-on from that, I would ask, is about Algeria. You had mentioned this in the report about crackdown once the migrants get there. I'm also curious about, I think there's this presupposition that the Algerian military and security services are this ubiquitous force on the border, and how do migrants and the passeurs and coxeurs get past that barrier? So those are two questions more. Sorry, sort of related. Okay, thank you. So the first question, in terms of these new hubs, so yes, the use of Agadez for human smuggling it's more or less stopped. I'd say obviously that there is still human smuggling taking place in Agadez, but what's happened is that there are these new hubs
so Tawa in particular, that are catering to the increased demand for movements to Algeria. But I'd say they haven't necessarily replaced Agadez. What has replaced Agadez is these remote routes. So this is just a completely different way of organizing human smuggling. So basically, there will be, so for instance, the route between the Nigerian border and the Libyan border, rather than smugglers taking migrants to a specific hub and the migrants staying there for a couple of days and then having a second smuggler take them to the Libyan border, they've actually set up exchange points in very, very remote locations in the desert. So there's one in particular that's called Kurikantana, and that's an exchange point. You know, there's just a village and a market, but it's known now by smugglers to be the area where the first network of smugglers will drop off migrants after taking them from the Nigerian border to Kurikantana, and then there'll be a second set of smugglers who will collect them from Kurikantana and take them all the way to southern Libya. So these are two different smuggling networks, but they work together. So it's quite a sophisticated operation. So in terms of whether the crackdown has kind of followed these new operation modes, let's say, of the human smuggling networks, they have to some extent. For instance, that remote route I mentioned between Nigeria and Libya, there were some operations in 2021. The Nigerian military organized for several weeks some patrols in the area. There were some arrests, but it was very limited because in order to conduct these operations and mainly the patrols in these areas, it's very expensive. You need good vehicles, you need a lot of fuel, and it's not necessarily something you can sustain in the long term. So usually it's a temporary uptick in security measures and patrols with the aim to dismantle networks. It's not always that effective. We have seen the same thing in Tawa, for instance, earlier this year. End of 2021 until February of this year, there was apparently a crackdown in Tawa. So this involved raids of the houses of smugglers, increased checks on the entry and the exit of the town. And that apparently did affect the number of departures from Tawa to Algeria. But since February, apparently these have ceased. And so departures have resumed. So sometimes so I guess the answer is that yes, there have been crackdowns, but none as important as the one in Agadez, and none as effective as what the Nigerian security forces were able to do in terms of the dismantlement of Agadez networks. In terms of Algeria and Algerian expulsions, correct me if I'm wrong, but your question was in terms of how smugglers actually bypass the Algerian border security, right, at the border?
That's right. Yeah, because I mean, my understanding of the Algerian military, at least, is that there's a very strong presence along the southern border. So I would wonder in what capacity would migrants and their traffickers be able to, be able to get them across the border without protection.
Well, what happens for the Algerian border is that smugglers will take their passengers as far as Samaka, which is just at the border. And the migrants will actually be dropped off a few kilometers from the Algerian borders. So they'll disembark and they'll have to continue on foot. And that involves crossing the 2 to 4 meter high sand berm, which is the fortification along the Algerian border, which has been closed since 2013. So migrants have to cross the berm. It's a very dangerous operation. They have to cross it on foot. And then once they reach the other side, normally the other set of passers, of smugglers on the Algerian side, will collect them and continue the journey to usually to Taman Khasset. Sometimes, though, they get to the other side and there's no one to pick them up, and then they have to walk all the way to the nearest town. So that is actually a very, very risky and dangerous section of the journey. Also, a few weeks ago, there was a banditry attack very close to the area where migrants have to cross the border. So it's in general quite a dangerous. It's a very dangerous leg of the journey. And usually once migrants reach Algeria, they're also the target of raids to gather up migrants for the expulsions. So they do face very important obstacles on these routes. Thank you.
So we have quite a few questions now that have come up. This one stands out, and it's something that either one of you could answer. So Mark, since we haven't heard from you for a little while, I'll ask you, do you see any signs of Russian or Sudanese logistical support to traffickers and smugglers in Libya, Chad and Niger? So we can start with Libya. And well, this person says the W word being Wagner Group. So thank you for highlighting that, Ewan. So Mark, go ahead.
If I may, I think I'll combine the answer with that from a question by it's Julien Simon from ICMPD, where he asked about the instrumentalization of migration in a war context. So this is interesting because so in respect, let's start with Wagner first. So in respect to Wagner, the short answer is no. We have so far not seen their involvement in respect to direct involvement in human smuggling and trafficking at the borders, at the Libyan southern border with Chad or Sudan. On the Sudanese side, there is involvement by the RSF, which had peaked around 2018 and is still present, but is not, I believe, at the same levels it was around 2018 and even further than that, 2019 and beginning of 2020. However, in respect to the question on foreign involvement more generally in Libya, again, foreign involvement in human smuggling and trafficking, I'm saying, for strategic purposes. Obviously, if we're talking about, if we also incorporate in that sort of strategic incorporation of migration in respect to foreign entities, we have the example of states and non-state entities. There's the example of Morocco, very recent, with the recent agreement between Morocco and Spain, which led to Spain changing its position on Western Sahara. We saw this recently as well in various pronouncements stemming out of Tunisia. And we see this constantly in Libya, both in the posturing of various militias and also in the posturing of the government. Although that said, our assessment is that the Dbeiba government is far less interested in migration than the GNA was before it. With regards to exploitation in a war context, again, we don't really have any evidence of this, and I'll give one recent concrete example. Recently, we were asked incessantly about the notion that Russia was involved in the recent spike of migrants departing from Eastern Libya. So over the past year and a half, there's been a very consistent trend of migrants departing from Eastern Libya targeting Italy, specifically the areas around Calabria, The numbers have been increasing. The modality is different, and it is different from other parts of the country, in that they typically involve larger vessels embarking many more people, and the distance, the greater distance, means that it requires more planning. And this happens after quite a few years where any movement from Eastern Libya was practically dormant. There was no activity to speak of. And the question was whether Russia was involved in this, possibly via the Wagner Group, as a means to destabilize Italy/Europe. And there has been some press reports about this, and in some reports that I saw, they were even quoting anonymous sources within the Italian security service. We looked into it and found zero evidence of this. Wagner has no presence that we know of in and around the embarkation points. We've picked up no sign that Wagner or Russia is involved in any of this activity. But there's no question that at least elements within the LNA have sanctioned at least a portion of this activity. We also know that the LNA, in a semi-legitimate manner, profits from the work visas given to Bangladeshis and some Egyptians, and therefore has an indirect interest in this. We also know that the LNA has been, the LAAF has been for a number of years now, tapping into various different markets to derive income, including illicit markets. So in the context and the scheme of things, when I put, first of all, the information that we received in context, but also these two elements, one of them being the developments over the recent years that sort of point to the more straightforward assessment that the LAF, which has a very significant control over various parts of the East, is essentially protecting this market, as well as the fact that although the numbers have been increasing, so far we haven't seen a catastrophic number of a catastrophic explosion in the level of activity. And capacity-wise, if Russia had to, or any other country really, if there was a concerted effort to organize a mass departure from the east of Libya with the consent of the groups that have control on the ground, principally the LAF, I would expect to see many more than the few thousand of migrants that we've so far seen leave the east of Libya. So while I don't exclude that this sort of thing can happen in the future, because we know that the instrumentalization of migration is a thing, so far I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever of it.
Thanks, Mark. I wanted to ask Renata Brito in a second, but if Renata, if you can hang on just one quick second, because there's a question I wanted to follow on with what that kind of piggybacks easily from what Mark was just talking about. Mark, could you address, you had gotten into the relationship, obviously, of armed groups as being part of trafficking networks, but would you be willing to explain a little bit about some of the armed groups that actually work on anti-migration or anti-crime raids or investigations in both East and West Libya, and how that plays into the broader dynamic of competition among armed groups?
So, to be fair and sort of reflective of what I think reality is, I think there are different categories of armed groups that fall within the broader umbrella of armed groups taking up law enforcement in general as sort of their raison d'etre and what they stand for. I think there's a cohort of armed groups that are relatively legitimate, pursuing relatively legitimate means. Typically, these armed groups are either very, very rooted in their community and therefore have a lot of political capital to lose if they do things that are that rub their community the wrong way. And migration increasingly, this is an important caveat, is becoming one of those things, in the sense that COVID-19 has, as has happened everywhere else in the world, has exacerbated the situation economically and in terms of access to food, inflation, etc., etc. That was obviously followed by the double whammy of the Ukraine crisis. This has resulted in a very appreciable rise in the temperature when it comes to xenophobic actions against migrant populations, racist actions, and just general discomfort at migrant groups. Over the past year and a half, we have seen various different incidents where local populations have sort of expressed frustration and even taken action to try and push migrant populations out of their territory. And therefore, militias that are perceived to be responsible for a surge in migrants in their hometown can face problems. So militias that have a significant degree of political capital that they can lose, and typically which are otherwise well-financed, so they have some other stream of funding that doesn't require on them tapping into illicit funds. Some of these militias are genuinely targeting law enforcement, and within that scope, they target irregular migration as part of their law enforcement activity. That's one category. The second category is a much more cynical and predatory model, whereby the human smuggling mantle is more or less a facade, where the same groups that are involved in migration management and are currently running detention centers, they're running interception at sea, they're running interception on land, presenting themselves as very effective, and also conducting raids, arresting migrants, and very often promoting this activity as examples, as an example of the fact that they're reliable partners in the fight against human smuggling, including with some raids on human smugglers, for instance. At the same time, we find that they often play a double game, which sees rife extortion in the detention centers that they run, protection that takes place on coastal areas where some departure zones are favored over others, clearly indicating that there's some sort of protection mechanism, etc., etc. So we see this paradigm. And while this per se is not new, so we had seen variations of this in the past, the level of sophistication is much higher now. The level of capture is much higher now. The size of these groups now is much more significant. And thirdly, and more importantly, which is the point I had concluded on, their political influence is a lot more significant than it was before. I think even the political landscape in Libya has really turned the page on that. And while there was a period when, especially when Bashar was touting himself as the anti-criminal law enforcement candidate, there was a time there where I think among Libyans there was some hope that a page could be turned. I think that chapter is closed, and I'm not quite sure how it can be reopened.
And I think that's part of the reason why it's so difficult for European interlocutors to know who is legitimate, who isn't, who's actually doing what they say they're doing, and the others that are just using it as a front. Yeah. Okay, so I did want to move to Renata. Please go ahead and answer or ask your question.
Hi. I thought it was very timely that you were talking about the changes in smuggling or the revival of more sophisticated smuggling today, because we had reports of two very large boats in distress, with one with 700 people, another one with 300, and last night another one with 400 that was rescued apparently by the Italian Coast Guard. I just wanted to know and understand that a little bit better, if they're taking off from the east of Libya, and if you can give us more insights into these apparently renewed smuggling networks, or not new, but apparently more active. And it seems they also bring a lot of Egyptians on board, as well as other nationalities. So if you have any insights on that.
Alice, did you want to give one a shot?
I think this is more for Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't have information on these two particular boats. Although I just texted a colleague who is on the call, who might be able to help on them. That said, so in terms of percentages, in the east, we're seeing about 20% of departures taking place. So I want to put everything in context. The west is still the more important of the embarkation points. In terms of the shape of what I'm referring to as more sophisticated groups, over the past, say, 3-4 years, it's not that human smuggling disappeared entirely, and not that the embarkation of migrants was totally unsophisticated. But as I said earlier, what we saw was greater procurement of wooden vessels, which in itself is a challenge in terms of procurement. So it is in respect to departures from Eastern Libya. There is evidence of boat building in Eastern Libya. There's evidence of boat building also in Western Libya. But there has also been evidence over the past couple of years of boats being sailed all the way from Zuara to the east of Libya, say for Tobruk, for instance, which is an extraordinary distance, only for the vessel then to embark migrants in the east of Libya and then sail to Italy, which is a very complex maritime operation, which in turn then requires the smuggling group that's operating to ensure value added. What do I mean by that? If your business model is chasing the lowest common denominator and basically just getting numbers on boats and selling that space for the lowest price possible, there's no way you can sustain this level of sophistication. So sourcing a vessel from Zuara, stealing that vessel, or paying off someone to purchase that vessel, sailing that vessel all the way to Tobruk, to then embark 400 migrants, and that's that. Because if you're selling those 400 seats at 1,000 Libyan dinar per seat, as in the height of the migration crisis, we had many reports of those sort of prices, that wouldn't be sustainable. So what you need to do is create value added. So go after migrants that are able to pay more, and then the process you enlarge the value of what you're selling, and therefore can invest much more in the logistics of what you're producing. And the example of Bangladeshis is very strong in that respect, because Bangladeshi migrants can spend north of 7,000 and even 10,000 euros on their journey to Europe, and that entails the visa process of them coming into Libya and then embarking on a vessel and then leaving. Egyptians also increased for two reasons. One, because they're a salient group in this sense, but also because there's been a change. So for a period, Egyptians were barred from moving to Libya after the infamous ISIS decapitation of a number of Coptic Egyptians in 2015. That's relented over time, and therefore mobility of legitimate Egyptian workers coming to Libya for work also increased as a result. But at the same time, this happened when more smuggling networks were investing basically in capturing at least a portion of this market for their business. This is what I mean by increased sophistication. In 2018, 2017, we had lost sight of this kind of sophistication, whereas previously in 2016, 2015, and 2017, there were examples of this, particularly in respect back then to the Eritrean community, for instance, where again there we saw proper transnational criminal management in place.
So I think this is something really important that you're talking about, Mark, about the different push-pull factors relative to each country and what is driving migrants to make the move in the first place. So there's a question that relates to this, and it's, I think, a little bit more appropriate for Alice, about the Lake Chad Basin and the efforts that the government there has made, or governments have made, to crack down on ISIS and Boko Haram there. What evidence have you seen of the effectiveness of those measures by those governments, and has it impacted whether or not migrants are willing to make the move northward?
Thank you. I think that's rather a complex question, but in terms of human smuggling routes, to my knowledge, there are not that many human smuggling movements in that area, due precisely to insecurity. Also, I think the type of movements we're seeing in that area are a vast majority, if not all of them, are related to displacement. So that is definitely one of the major dynamics in the area. We've seen in particular over the last year or so repeated outbreaks of conflict in northern Cameroon that have affected the situation with the Chadian border. So we've seen several times during the year mass displacement of populations from northern Cameroon into Chad. This has continued in 2022. So I think in terms of movements of people, that's the most significant dynamic that I know of. And I think efforts in the area to address the question of border security and border management are obviously more directed at the movement of individuals or groups that are suspected to be in relation to violent extremism. So that's all I can say for now on that topic. But yeah, certainly attention should be paid to that area in terms of the different movements that we are seeing, and in particular the situation at the border between the Chadian capital N'Djamena and Cameroon, where there's some really quite serious dynamics at play, and a huge need of assistance to displaced people.
Thanks, Alice. So one other question that's sort of related to this is the connection of human traffickers and human smugglers with other modes of criminal activity. So things like weapons transfers or drug trade, gold, you had mentioned also. Would you be able to get in a little bit more onto that and sort of talk about the overlap, if there is any, and what sort of goods are prominent along the same routes or along the same, with the same groups that are trafficking in humans?
Right. Well, I think overall there's very little overlap in terms of actors. Typically, and as I mentioned in my presentation, actors involved in human smuggling are not really involved in forms of trafficking such as, you know, arms trafficking and, you know, further into you know, the activities of violent extremist groups. What we see is that in some cases, there are actors who have moved away from human smuggling and might become involved in different forms of illicit activities, such as drug trafficking or armed banditry, or maybe in some cases arms trafficking. But really, I think that's quite a specific type of activity, and it involves you know, groups that have the means to transport high value commodities, and therefore they're really groups that, you know, they have very efficient vehicles. They have lots of you know, they have the resources to navigate the types of routes that are used for arms trafficking. But then at a lower level, then yes, there is a little bit of overlap between human smuggling and some forms of drug trafficking. We know that some smugglers, in order to make up their income for a journey, when they don't necessarily have enough migrants to transport, they may be also transporting very small quantities of drugs. In particular, this would be perhaps small quantities of hashish, or it might be a few grams of cocaine, but nothing really major, and nothing that would really constitute like organized drug trafficking. And I'd say, yeah, there are really sort of two levels of actors, and those involved in human smuggling will not necessarily have the means and the integration into networks that are involved in sort of higher level trafficking. But that's not set in stone either. Obviously, there's also, you know, a lot of changing dynamics, and with more and more actors moving away from human smuggling, we could be seeing, you know, an increase in other forms of trafficking with these actors. But I think in particular, we should be also looking at armed banditry as an alternative livelihood, especially in the Agadez region. As I mentioned, the multiplication of attacks that are much closer to main roads and main towns, that are not these are not attacks that are led by Chadian groups typically, who don't really, that I know of, venture that far into, you know, closer to the cities. These are local groups, and these are typically groups that could have also been at some point involved in human smuggling. So we are seeing shifts in roles, and potentially there is at that level some overlap.
So the armed bandits, you said, or may have been former human smugglers themselves, and is this part of a way to gain competition? Yeah, present a competition to the armed group that is in control of a particular route?
Well, what we do know, we do have some evidence that smugglers who have moved away from human smuggling because of just the lack of demand and the risks involved since 2016. We have evidence that some, you know, in, you know, the interviews that we've conducted, that some of them have turned to armed groups. But when we talk of human smuggling and smugglers themselves, I think we should try and avoid thinking of them as like one very specific, clearly identified profile. Like there can be smugglers who are involved in a range of different activities, both licit and illicit. They could also be involved in different, forms of trade also between Libya and Niger. There are also actors, who maybe have other economic activities that don't involve movements between the two countries. So it's not so much like smugglers becoming drug traffickers or smugglers become bandits, and they can also move between the two. And that's also the case for bandits that themselves. Bandits is a term we use quite loosely. They're actors who are involved in groups that can range from just a small group with a couple of vehicles to much larger groups. And these actors who can also at different stages be involved in a range of different activities. In particular, this is true for the Chadian groups who are active in the cross-border areas. They can at different times be involved in activities such as the escorting of convoys, so they can be paid by drug traffickers to escort their convoys between Niger and Libya, for instance. And at different times, they can be the very same bandits that are going to be attacking these convoys. It really is a very opportunistic activity. And so there is a lot of blurred lines between the different profiles of actors. And I think that's probably true also for a number of actors in Chad and across the border in southern Libya.
So I do want to note we're going to 4:30, so I'm going to try to get through as many questions as possible. So Mark, to you, I'm going to sort of blend two questions about one is engagement with the Libyan Coast Guard and how European interlocutors can do that in a way that matches values. And then there's a question about the relationship of the new Italian government with the Tripoli government and how that might impact that relationship.
Okay. So vis-a-vis the Libyan Coast Guard, I try not to sound like a broken record in respect to these questions, but I think the biggest problem is coordination and lack of leverage. So to begin with, the landscape is very challenging, very difficult. One thing that I think is wildly overestimated by the critics of the European Union is how little leverage the European Union has in Libya, and how little leverage many different international players have in Libya, actually. The subtext of a lot of the criticism is typically that that there is this massive leverage that is totally discarded because cynical goals are being pursued. And while I'm not dismissive entirely of that criticism, what I'm saying is there's very little leverage. But I see very little effort in maximizing that leverage. And unless, if we're talking about the European Union, there is greater coordination and greater solidification of the platform with which Libyans are engaged, that leverage is going to remain weak. And as long as it's weak, there's not going to be the possibility to have a frank conversation and start implementing red lines. And the red lines that need to be implemented, particularly in a situation where you've got militias further encroaching into the space of state entities, is to demarcate those lines and say, look, I'm interested in cooperation because I've got a set of priorities that I want to achieve, and I know you've got a set of priorities that you want to achieve, and they can overlap, and therefore this partnership makes sense, but not at any cost. And therefore these are our red lines, and if you don't respect them, we will pull out. As long as there is leverage, there isn't leverage, or there isn't substantive leverage, that position is impossible. And what we see very often is this limbo in between, where the leverage is missing, and therefore assertiveness is missing as a result, and there's a sort of mishmash in the middle that is not satisfactory for any side. With regards to the relationship of the Italian government with Libya, yeah, to be honest, I'm as curious as anyone to see how this is going to pan out. If we're going to see a repeat of the period within which Salvini was Minister of Interior, and there was a very young and at that point very inexperienced Foreign Affairs Minister. During that period, Italy lost major traction in Libya. So Italy was in a very, very good position right up to 2017. Whether you like or not what they did with migration up to 2017, that required a lot of engagement and a lot of involvement on the part of the Libyans. After 2017, they lost it, and they lost it because the Salvini, the administration when Salvini was Minister of Interior and pretty much responsible, at least politically, for and within the scheme of that coalition for migration. There was more an interest to pursue symbolic victories, which were pretty empty, such as the battle that Salvini put up with NGOs, which ultimately had very, very little impact on the number of migrants that arrived in Italy, if that was the goal, which it was. Then to pursue, what is ultimately the longer slog and the more boring but more persistent work, which is politics, which requires building connections, having a clear strategy, and pursuing it relentlessly. That's not very popular. It's very difficult to sell that with a couple of sound bites on television, and as a result, it's not very populist. I'm not an expert on Italian politics. I'm still not sure that this government is going to be necessarily that. They've taken quite a few decisions on certain positions that sort of are not very easy to read, at least for someone like me who is not embedded in Italian politics. So I think the jury is still out. It depends how they're going to play their cards.
So this is a related question. It's about Frontex. I have to say that I don't know about this, about a scandal in Frontex involving the turning back of migrants. In any of your research, to either Alice or Mark, is that something that you heard about in your interviews with the migrants that you've interacted with?
No, it's not. Yeah, Frontex is not that relevant in the Central Mediterranean. I'm afraid for them. Since Frontex decided to move back its area of operation, it doesn't hold the same level of relevance that it did in the Aegean, where that scandal primarily relates to. Whereas in the Aegean, it was a very on the front line sort of support force. In the Mediterranean, it ceased being a protagonist quite a few years ago.
Alice, do you have anything to add to that? No. So a really interesting question. When it comes to artisanal gold that's mined and smuggled, where does it go to? Have you been following the path of gold? I guess that would be more for Alice than Mark.
Yeah, so right now, so I haven't actually studied that side of gold mining. We do actually, if some participants are interested, have a report that's either just come out or coming out soon on the economy of gold across the region. This is sort of more specific to West Africa, but also relevant to Niger and Chad. What we know is that a lot of the gold, from Niger and Chad, is usually ends up in the Middle East and is then, enters sort of more formal gold economies. But basically, there is, like a big difference between the types of networks involved in gold mining in these countries, which are very much informal and in some cases even illicit, because a lot of these gold mines are actually officially closed, such as the Komi-Bougoudi goldfield until very recently. In Niger, also the Jado goldfield is officially closed. So these are very much illicit and informal activities. And then once the gold is then sold to, within the international gold trading level, then that enters a completely different. It involves completely different dynamics, and it then enters its own I guess, level of actors that is much more formal and official. So I think, we're really talking about two very different systems there, and in these areas, that we're working on, gold mining is seen and perceived from a national level as a really touchy, very difficult topic to work on. So it's in many cases seen as a threat to local and national security, especially in Chad. But at the same time, it's extremely important for local livelihoods and also for regional livelihoods that have, that are very, very strongly reliant on gold. And so there are a lot of economic and political dynamics at play. Sorry, a little bit off topic, but I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Just to add very quickly to that, Dubai is in the Middle East a very important funnel for a large share of that gold. So both, for instance, gold deposits in Niger and Chad that are eventually sort of sold down into the capitals, the respective capitals, Niamey and N'Djamena, and then flown or bought actually with traders that are sent from Dubai to purchase gold and then flown into Dubai. As well as large deposits that go from Sudan, many of them managed by armed groups that have a significant hold on gold mines, and particularly in the north, as well as South Sudan, as well as the Darfur, I meant, and finally Libya as well, where a portion of the gold that gets extracted from the south, both within the Libyan borders, but also within Chad and Niger as well as their extent, again gets sold into the capital, goes into Tripoli, and a portion of it gets exported and goes to Dubai.
Okay. On that note, so we're approaching 4:30, and I would like to thank everyone for joining today, and to our panelists, Mark Micallef and Alice Faraday, for their insightful comments. And please go to the website and check out all of the publications there on all of the North African countries of the Maghreb, and in addition, Mali, Niger, and Chad. So thank you, everyone. This will be online after we conclude. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.